Welcome back to Make It Stick. We'll jump right into Anki, which we have 2 flashcards for. What are the 9 sections and 9 subsections of Chapter 4, Embrace Difficulties? How learning occurs. Encoding, consolidation, retrieval. Extended learning, updating retrieval cues. Easier isn't better. How effort helps. Creating mental models. Reconsolidating memories. Broadening mastery. Improving versatility. Priming the mind for learning. Dude, we forgot this one. Did I say broadening mastery? All right, hold on. Broadening mastery. Creating mental models. Reconsolidating memories. Improving versatility. Priming the mind for learning, fostering conceptual learning. Other learning strategies that incorporate desirable difficulties. An example of generative learning. Failure, or it goes failure in the myth of errorless learning. An example of generative learning. Undesirable difficulties, the takeaway. Wow, there we go. Good. What are the 7 sections of Chapter 7? Increase your abilities. Neuroplasticity is IQ mutable. Brain training. Growth mindset. Desirable difficulties. Memory cues, the takeaway. Well done. What did we learn yesterday then and Make It Stick? Well, we're in the section on neuroplasticity. We read about some neurodevelopment. This book's over 10 years old, and I've taken Neuro 1 and 2 in the past year, so I didn't fully agree with everything they had to say. Beyond that, they're not neuroscientists, they're cognitive psychologists. So somewhere in there, I didn't fully agree with everything they were saying. There's 5 stages of neurodevelopment. I believe the last one is synaptic pruning. What would they? I know that it'll come back to me at some point. But basically, the brain overdevelops synaptic connections early in life, and then a lot of learning, motor skills, particularly like walking, is not that it's gaining new synaptic connections. It's mostly about pruning the extraneous ones away and becoming cleaner and smoother. So they kind of went ahead and said that most of the complex learning of our lives occurs, teenage years and on. And actually, they said within your teenage years, during puberty is when, or around puberty is when the synaptic pruning begins. I think synaptic pruning begins a lot sooner than that, but I'm not certain. Anyway, they say when little to no synaptic growth is actually occurring is when we learn the most logical, complex stuff. And I don't know if that's true either. I think the overall total of your synaptic connections can be decreasing, but you can still be gaining a lot of new connections, particularly about the things you're learning. So I think there are synaptic connections that are formed when you're learning new things. That's just a hypothesis, an educated guess on what I've learned. Right, learning is a physical phenomena. The brain physically changes when we learn in some way, whether it's new connections or it's strengthening the myelin of a connection that already exists or a circuit that already exists. Those are the 2 ways I can think of. There's a lot of other ways that the brain can change, increasing the amount of receptors on a dendrite, or the number of vesicles that are released from the axon terminal, or decreasing the number of receptors or changing the receptors on a dendrite. There's definitely other ways as well, but yeah, learning is like a physiological thing. You got the neurodevelopment stuff, what I agreed with, what I didn't agree with. Right, Paul Bocchi-Rita was next. This was we studied him in our neuro textbook. He's a pretty fundamental guy in neuroscience. He was an engineer that built these devices that would essentially cause electric shocks in the tongue. He might have done more diverse stuff as well, but it helped people that were blind see, because the eyes just receive information. The brain processes it to help you actually see. So the eyes don't see, the brain sees. And so when this guy had like a camera on his head, essentially in a helmet, he was receiving electric shocks on his tongue based on the visual information that was coming in, and it eventually started to learn, how to see things, certain things. I'm sure it wasn't that fine-tuned, but he could start to see maybe where walls were when things were coming towards, and he could see basic shapes, or at least interpret basic shapes, right? The landmark one we studied was the woman with the vestibular problem. She had like an ear infection, and then she lost her sense of balance, and he helped her regain her sense of balance with one of these devices that had levels, like construction levels on the helmet, and then based on how she tilted her head, it would send different shocks to her tongue. So this is neuroplasticity. This is rewiring. The electrical stimulation on the tongue started to get connected with the visual system or the vestibular system in these two cases. So these are just examples of neuroplasticity and how the brain rewires when we lose certain things. Like the nearby brain regions will actually take over those neurons and make those neurons useful. Brain is very resourceful in that way. And I think that's basically everything. We talked also about this new adaptation of this, where they put vests with like different pressure signals that would connect to the plane for a pilot, and based on these instrument readings, it would send different pressure, feelings, senses, or not senses, but send different like pressures so that the pilot can interpret and learn to feel things that he otherwise wouldn't be able to feel in the plane. Instead of just being able to see the instruments, he could feel like, oh, this is the direction we're facing, or this is like our I don't know what you call it, pitch or yaw, pitch, yaw, I don't remember. Yeah, pitch, yaw, those are certain orientations in space. Roll, pitch, yaw, okay. Okay, let's see if we got everything, and we'll continue reading it. So, all right, genes largely determine the gross structure of your brain, but the actual connections, my input is in the cortices probably largely, are unique and probably a lot more determined by environment than just genes alone. Right, the brain is not static, the brain is not fixed, the brain is very mutable and is constantly changing all the time with new experiences. All right. Now I will continue reading, and I'll be back to recall in a little bit. All right, guys, we just finished up reading the section on neuroplasticity. Overall, this section is just about how the brain physically changes all the time throughout our whole lifetime, and that learning physically changes the brain. Within the section, we read about the connectome, which is similar to the Human Genome Project. This is the Human Connectome Project, that they've been trying to map the architecture and connections of the brain, which it's like, yeah, maybe some of them are pretty, deep in the brain, in the brain stem. Those connections are. Why is there just pounding in this apartment? Anyway. Right. Connectome Project, deep brain. Okay. So, right. Through twin studies in the Connectome Project, we've seen that the architecture, the connections of the brain continue to change throughout our lifetime 40s, 50s, 60s. Unlike our physical body, which matures, if you're a female, maybe largely by the time you're in your late teens. For a male, maybe early 20s. The brain is not so. It continues to develop throughout your life for decades longer. Increasing skills, especially motor skills, lead to a correlation with or more myelination. More myelination means there's more coating around the axons. This leads to more efficient transfer of information, faster, more efficient. Okay. What else do we have? Connectome, brain. Right. Habits are have different connections in brain activity than conscious, deliberate actions. But as we train things like motor skills, sequential tasks, we begin to become more and more habitual and reflexive and automatic with these behaviors and movements. And this is actually, I believe, developing more connections down in the basal ganglia, which is kind of goes against what I was saying earlier about the brain physically changing and the cortices. The basal ganglia is deeper with more automatic behaviors. So I don't know where the heartbeat is controlled. It might be in the deep basal ganglia, but things like blinking and maybe even breathing are in the basal ganglia. So I feel like that's a little dangerous evolutionarily to be able to change things in there with behavior, such as learning to play the piano, but they must be separate enough. Like vital, very vital, and non-vital automatic behaviors. Okay. Neuroplasticity. What else? Right. So intelligence is a relationship. It's an interaction. It's a dialogue between nature and nurture, genes and environment. And so the rest of this chapter is exploring that relationship between intelligence, the dialogue between nature and nurture, and developing intelligence. Man, we're missing some stuff here. As far as the next section goes, it is IQ mutable is the next section. Basically, what I've read so far, IQ is, again, a relationship between, it's not the same thing as intelligence, but IQ as well as intelligence is the same. It is a relationship between genes and environment, nature and nurture. And however, there's the Flynn effect. So over the past, there's been an increase in the average IQ since the inception of the test for the past about 90 years. They said, so the IQ 100 is the mean of the test takers, the average, and so the mean has been increasing. So the 100 stays the same, but 100 in 2014 was the equivalent of 118 in 1960. So why is that? We don't know exactly. The hypotheses are nutrition, improvements in the education, the schooling system, like more schooling, more progress in education, as well as culture, TV, radio, newspapers, all these things that, not necessarily newspapers, it's internet, bringing new ideas, new words, new concepts, to the general public. What am I forgetting now on neuroplasticity? Neurogenesis. This was very interesting. So everybody, at least in neuroscience, has heard about neurogenesis. It's the production of new neurons. In 2025, we're like, yes, it does occur, but it's very small. It's typically mostly in the hippocampus. That's what they talk about as the hippocampus. We're talking on the scale of like hundreds of neurons maybe per day, but the brain is like billions and billions of neurons, so it's not that much. But apparently the book claims, as far as I understand, that not only does learning increase neurogenesis, but neurogenesis increases before the learning event. So somehow the brain is already deciding it's going to consciously, effortfully learn, and so it increases the amount of neurogenesis before you even start learning. So maybe you don't even think you're going to be like, I'm going to start learning. Your brain already has decided you're going to start learning. And this is the whole thing with free will and determinism that most people don't understand or aren't even aware of, is there's a lot of things that happen below the surface of consciousness that kind of already decide what you're going to do, and then you think that you decided that you are going to do it, but in reality it already was decided. And we know that through certain things like this, if this neurogenesis claim is true. Okay, they talked about chunking, right? Chunking is connecting different brain circuits into basically tight connection, a fluid connection where they're very linking multiple brain circuits. And so they talked about chunking as in motor skills, like playing the piano, with conscious, like musical thought. So, but chunking is a big concept in learning how to learn and a mind for numbers. And chunking really is just about, building up a neural circuit into one, bigger neural circuit with connected ideas. So when you think of, say you think of pen, you train yourself to think of whatever, red, right? That's like a very chunked thing. Red pen is something that where you get a cue, such as I'm gonna play this song. You can just play the whole song. Whereas when you started, you couldn't even play like the first bar. You had to start learning the notes, and then you had to connect the notes into the rhythm, and you had to memorize the different parts of the song and the transitions, and eventually you can just think, I want to play Let It Be, and then you can play Let It Be, and it's like one chunk. You don't have to think about connecting different ideas. You don't have to try to remember stuff. You can just do things. That was always kind of weird. Well, not weird, but a difficult thing to grasp initially and explain what chunking was. But I think I've got a decent understanding now. I mean, that wasn't the best explanation in the world, but hopefully it makes a little bit of sense. All right. I don't know if we started reading faster recently. I've been reading a lot, so maybe my reading speed's increased a little bit, but also I've been more focused on less on the ideas and more on the general big picture. And also neuroscience. I know a lot about neuroscience and the stuff, the basic neuroscience they're talking about, so it doesn't take a long time to think through. I can be like, I already know that. But we've been reading more, like twice as much almost. Well, maybe 2/3 as much. I don't know. Like 1.5 times as much as I was in the past. I'm reading like 3.5 pages a day on average. So at that rate, we've got like 80 pages left. Gosh, there's a lot of stuff back here that isn't reading. There we go. Oh, there we go. 253. Yeah, we have 80 pages left. So at that rate, we're going to finish in about 26 days, or actually 3.5, it'd be less than that, but 23 days. So I don't know if that's going to hold up. It won't, because we'll have the ChatGPT quiz at the end of the chapters and the Anki flashcards and stuff, but I have to say it might be reasonable that we will be done within a month, which is very cool because we're nearly 3 months in. So kind of actually getting near the home stretch. Not quite, but depends on how you look at it. So that's it for today. I'll talk to you later. See you.